Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is December 31st, 2024. Yes, Tuesday, December 31st, 2024, the last day of 2024. So, Happy New Year's, everybody. And let's get on to our first story, which is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled Peruvian Sacrificial Site Contains the Remains of Over 140 Children. Pardon me. An archaeological dig at Juan Chaquito Las Llamas in Peru was found to contain the mummified remains of 140 children that were part of a mass sacrifice sometime during the 15th century. The victims were both boys and girls between the ages of 5 and 14. Examination of the remains found the children's hearts were ripped from their bodies. A study of the cranial modification and stable isotope analysis of carbon and nitrogen indicates that children of both sexes were taken from different regions and groups throughout the Chimu Empire. The slaughter site spans more than 7,000 square feet, and the remains of 200 young, either alpacas or llamas, were found as well. Examination of the skeletons found that both the children and the animals had cut marks transecting the sternums and displaced ribs, which suggests they may have had their chests cut open, possibly during ritual removal of the heart. The excavations were conducted between 2011 and 2016, and radiocarbon dates the remains to about 1450 AD, when the Chimu culture occupied the area, which is about 350 miles north of Lima. The now extinct empire predated the Incas, who did take over many of their practices. The Chimu controlled a 600-mile stretch along the Pacific coast through the Peru-Ecuador border. The strip of desert measured 20 to 100 miles wide. The culture was mostly agricultural, but also survived by fishing. They worshipped the moon, which they believed was more powerful than the sun. The Sican culture, which predated the Chimu people, also practiced child sacrifice. John Verano, a bioarchaeologist at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana, who studies human sacrifice, said, "This site opens a new chapter on the practice of child sacrifice in the ancient world. This archaeological discovery was a surprise to all of us. We had not been seen anything like this before, and there was no suggestion from ethnohistoric sources or historic accounts of child or camelid sacrifices being made on such a scale in northern coastal Peru. What makes this discovery unusual is that the victims were all young children. Around 1350 AD, when the Chimu expanded their rule, a massacre of 200 victims, children, adults, and elderly, was committed. During the 1970s, an excavation at the Chimu capital of Chanchan, only a few miles away from the modern city of Trujillo, found hundreds of young women were sacrificed in a royal tomb to accompany their kings into the afterlife. Human sacrifices increased between the 11th and 15th century AD in the Lambayeque region. Some of the victims were sacrificed at important monuments. Others were killed on solitary hilltops. Prior to the discovery in Chanchan, sources describing child sacrifices were limited. Spanish friar Antonio de la Calancha detailed where children were killed by the Chimu in the Jequetepeque River Valley during lunar eclipses. He also named Molep, a local healer near the same valley, who sacrificed young victims to sacred places or huacas. In 1969, at Huanchaco, a seaside town, archaeologist Christopher Donnan unearthed what was left of 17 children and 20 camelids, buried in a mass pit without any offerings. The remains were dated to 1400 AD, and Donnan concluded they were sacrificed. This discovery was the closest, though on a smaller scale, to what was found at Juan Chaquito Las Llamas. 3 adult skeletons were found at HLL in 2014. There were 2 females, one 18-year-old and the other second between 20 to 30 years of age. They did not have their hearts torn out, but one was killed by a blow to the back of the head and the other suffered severe trauma to the face. The third remains belonged to a man 30 to 40 years of age. He had multiple ribs fractured. Both women were buried crouching, face down on their knees, and the man extended on his back. They were placed close to one another and the sacrificed children. Contrary to the belief that sacrifices were made during times of food shortages, examination of the remains found the children were in good health with only mild nutritional stress. Cristobal de Molina, a 16th century Spanish chronicler, described in his account of the fables and rites of the Incas that other children had their lives taken out, and so the priest offered the beating hearts to the huacas to which the sacrifice was made. He also recounted llamas and alpacas also had their hearts extracted. The same was observed by chroniclers in the 16th and 17th century, and still practiced in modern highland Peru. Gabriel Prieto, a professor of archaeology from the National University of Trujillo, said it appears that child sacrifice was widespread. At a nearby excavation, Pampa la Cruz, he had already found 132 kids and 250 llamas. The site dates back to the Chimu culture, which was 12th to the 15th century AD. The discoveries made in 2022 found the remains of children ranging in age from 4 to 14. Like the victims at HLL, which is the Juanchito location, they were cut open from the collarbone to the sternum in order to access their heart. Many of the children had cranial modifications. Despite all the children and animals sacrificed, possibly to stop adverse weathers, the gods were not appeased. Around 1470 AD, the Incas conquered the Chimu Empire, and their emperor Minchanacaman was taken as a royal hostage to Cusco, the Inca capital. Which means they might have done all the sacrifice, and the Incas still conquered them. And what's becoming apparent every time that they do these digs is that when all these conquistadors got there, a lot of them had chroniclers, and they were describing this widespread sacrifices. Not only here in Peru, but in Mexico and Mesoamerica, of thousands. And later on, these chroniclers were accused of inflating the numbers or outright lying, just to make the culture seem basically character assassination for the culture. But it turns out they were accurate. They were being accurate. As more and more of these discoveries of these archaeological sites are unearthed, they're finding that they were sacrificing hundreds or thousands of, and sometimes you also heard, well, the ones that were being sacrificed were captives, or warriors, from a skirmish. Not really. Sometimes they took from their own, or sometimes they raided nearby villages for victims. And you would think they're taking, of course, what's most important to any culture, which is the children. So yeah, it's very interesting but very disturbing how prevalent that was. Okay, next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories. Since we're on this vein, let's keep going down this. Is titled "Punishing the Dead." In January 2017, a discovery was made in Northamptonshire from the Romano-Pritan period. The corpse was buried face down, and his tongue had been cut out and replaced with a flat stone. These are all indicators that this individual was considered odd or a threat to the community. It is speculated that the man's tongue was cut out as a punishment for spreading malicious accusations, or perhaps he was scapegoated for bad weather, as the area where he was buried became a cemetery only when it became too flooded for habitation. An epidemic could also have been the reason why his corpse was punished, since an understanding of germs and bacteria was not understood when he lived. Ancient burials across Europe demonstrate the same methods in which there is a fear of the individuals beyond the time of their death. In 2012, a discovery was made in Zozopol, Bulgaria, of several skeletons with iron rods through their chest. A few years previously, other skeletons were found in Czechoslovakia, weighted down with stones on their chests. These burials dated back 5,000 years. Other corpses had been found decapitated, with their hearts pierced and buried in bogs or swampy areas. These persons had been suspected while alive, and when they were buried, measures were taken to make sure they did not become undead menaces. This is contrary to folklore about vampires, where a person was disinterred and mutilated and suspected of being evil after they had died. Iron Age Celtic burial sites across Britain and Ireland display practices where certain dead were considered dangerous to the living. The parts of the body that were targeted were the heart and the head, where it was believed the soul dwelt. Sometimes the individual's only sin was to die an unnatural sudden death through murder or accident. The fear was that this person had been cheated of a full life and were likely to rise from their grave. Desecrating the corpse after burial is thought to also have been a way to punish the individuals by not allowing their spirit to go into the afterlife. In Britain, deviant burials date back to the 11th century and are believed to have persisted into the Middle Ages and much less conspicuously into the 20th century. The worst offenders were denied burial in the churchyard. Farquhar Shaw was buried on the Rothmercus estate in Scotland. In 1405, 5 heavy stones were placed on a flat tombstone, and then a metal cage was placed over it to stop anyone from removing it. Wow, they really didn't want him to go anywhere, did they? This was done because Farquhar had troubled the neighborhood in life, and there was fear he would continue to be a problem after he was dead. Okay. In 1704, Lilias Addy committed suicide. She had been jailed at Torburn in Fife, accused of being a witch. Her body was buried in the foreshore between the high and low water mark, with a flat stone over it. She was doubly dangerous for being a possible witch and having done away with herself. Grave robbers dug her up in 1852, and it was reported her coffin measured 6 feet 6 inches in length. The skull still had most of its teeth, which were described as white and fresh, and her thigh bones were comparable to a man who measured 6 feet in height, which made her quite a tall woman in an age when the average female height was only 5 feet. In 1875, antiquarian Joseph Neil Patton was displaying the skull in his private museum in Dunfermline. 9 years later, Dr. Dow exhibited it to the Fifeshire Medical Association, and it eventually ended up at the Museum of the University of St. Andrews. In 1904, photographs were taken of Addy's remains, which are now held at the National Library of Scotland. The skull disappeared until 1938, when it was displayed at the Empire Exhibition at Bellahouston Park in Glasgow, its last known location. Even her coffin was used to make souvenirs. A walking stick with a silver band engraved with Lilias Addy, 1704, was donated to the Pittencrieff House Museum in 1927. In 1824, a saw pit near Tintern Abbey was being excavated by laborers. A skeleton was found in an orchard. It had been buried face down. A very old local woman voiced her suspicion that he was a man believed to have been murdered, but who disappeared from his home about 100 years before. Possibly the person who murdered and buried him wanted to make sure his victim would not return and seek vengeance from beyond the grave. In 1889, during an Edinburgh murder trial, the murdered man's clothes were produced in the court, but his boots were missing. It turned out the local constable had been ordered to bury them on the shore between the low and high water mark, just like Lilias Addy. This was to prevent him from walking among the living, and demonstrates that it wasn't only the murderer who feared him. In July 1915, a British officer saw 2 of his soldiers burying a dead German face down. Even in wartime, precautions fueled by superstition were taken to make sure the dead did not escape and seek retribution. In many detailed stories from the 19th and 20th century which originated in Russia, Austria, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, where those who were already dead were still blamed for severe weather. In 1891, a Russian woman who had died of alcohol poisoning was disinterred and used as a scapegoat, linking her death by fluid with an associated drop. In 1900, a summer drought in Czechoslovakia was blamed on the village schoolmaster who had been buried with a feather pillow beneath his head. The solution, of course, was to open the grave and remove the pillow. Folklorist Agnes Mergoci wrote how in 1926 in Zarnesti, Transylvania, heavy rains were blamed on the vampiric corpse of a recently buried girl. The following story that occurred in a rural area of Crimea demonstrates that fear of those who had died overrode even displeasing God. It's surprising. This is not medieval. Historically, this is pretty recent. Quote, when the prolonged drought of summer 1905 was blamed on a supposed wizard buried that March, the villagers of Savino Krivsa led a solemn torchlight procession to his grave on one Sunday at midnight. To the dirge-like playing of fiddles and flutes he was disinterred, so that the village priest could sprinkle him with holy water before reburial. Unfortunately, the priest, Father Constantine, objected and rashly upbraided the villagers for their barbarity and superstition. As a result, he was thrown into the grave with the offending corpse hurled in on top of him. He was hauled out the following day, but could not be revived. If not for two especially pious women who had alerted the police, we should never perhaps have known of this case at all. End quote. Cellini were burying grounds for stillborn and unbaptized infants, the mentally disabled, strangers, the shipwrecked, criminals, famine victims, and suicides. The sites proliferated in Ireland from the 17th century onward. Location for these unconsecrated cemeteries were usually deserted churches and graveyards, ancient monuments, boundary ditches, crossroads, castles, lakes, and seashores. The origins of this custom was the communal response to the Catholic Church's teaching on purgatory. A normal Christian burial means the body is oriented west to east in an extended or slightly supine position with no grave goods. In medieval Ireland, deviant burials, besides being excluded from consecrated grounds, could include decapitation, isolated burials, or burials in unusual places, amputations, and stones placed on the body or the grave itself. Removing the head or another body part, was to prevent the person from rising on Judgment Day, therefore not allowing them to be saved. During the 8th century, placing a rock within the mouth was linked to vampires and zombies. In 2008, two 8th century skeletons were unearthed in Kiltashee, Ireland. These burials predated the vampire hysteria that enveloped Europe in the 16th century. Both were men, one was between 40 and 60 years old, and the other between 20 and 30 years old. They were laid side by side. One was lying looking up with a large black stone shoved into his mouth. The other had his head turned to the side with an even larger stone wedged in between his teeth to the point his jaws were almost dislocated. The mouth was seen as where the soul left the body upon death. It was also the way an evil spirit could enter the body to reanimate it. Were these men dangerous people or just ordinary persons who died under mysterious circumstances or even murder? The men were only two of the 137 skeletons excavated between 2005 to 2009. It's estimated that about 3,000 skeletons were buried there from 700 to 1400 AD. Originally thought to have been a gravesite dating to the Black Death, the early date of 700 AD ended this hypothesis. In 1725, Peter Blagojevic, a Serbian peasant, died in his hometown. Soon after his death, 9 villagers died under mysterious circumstances. Blagojevic's wife stated that he had visited her and asked for his opanachi, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, which are shoes. She then moved to another village for safety reasons. Authorities exhumed Blagojevic's body, and it was found the body had not decomposed, and the corpse's hair and nails had grown. The villagers staked the corpse through the heart. Eyewitnesses said fresh blood poured from the wounds. A year after Blagojevic's death, The village of Medveda saw their own mysterious deaths. The suspect responsible was Arnold Paoli, a Serbian Hajduk. He had told people he had been attacked by a vampire at Gosowa, and he had eaten soil from the vampire's grave to cure himself. Paoli died after falling from a hay cart and breaking his neck in 1726. Four people who said he had visited them after his death sickened and died. Austrian authorities sent medics to investigate the case. Paoli was disinterred, and like Blagojevic, his body was said not to have decomposed, and his hair and nails had grown. The body and coffin were smeared with blood, and a stake was driven through the corpse's heart. According to reports, the dead man screamed out. The body was dismembered and burned. Another 12 people died supposedly from vampirism in the following 5 years. In total, 17 people who had died in the vicinity were exhumed and executed, with their hearts and heads removed and their ashes scattered in the river. So sometimes people, in other words, you could get in trouble if you were a bad character, they want to make sure you didn't, since you were a problem in life, they didn't want you to be a bigger problem in death. But sometimes all you had to do was wrong place, wrong time. You died a weird death. You fell, something happened, and it's like, well, bad luck. It's not his fault, but just in case, let's give him a deviant burial. Superstition. Very powerful, though. Very, very powerful. Okay, the next story is also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled Satan, Church Scandals, and Beyond. Disbelief and ridicule. This is the fear promoted by the devil, according to Father Gary Thomas, as it relates to sexual abuse victims, but it seems that secrecy is the devil's best ally. Father Gary Thomas has for many years been the exorcist for the Diocese of San Jose, California. He was mentored in Rome by Father Carmine de Felipis. The Rite, The Making of a Modern Exorcist, and the film The Rite, based on the book, included Father Thomas and his training in Rome. Despite the belief that demonic possession is visited only on the unfortunate who have strayed from belief in God, or intentionally become involved in Satanism, the very church, dedicated to protecting the vulnerable, has in some instances chosen to hide evil among its own clergy. The most pernicious of these secrets is the child abuse scandals that have rocked the Catholic Church in recent decades. However, prior to the disclosure of priests that were shuttled from parish to parish in order to hide their crimes, many clergy and parishioners knew or suspected that children were being targeted by pedophiles. The reason this went on for so long was the victims' fear that no one would believe them. This fear also silenced witnesses who suspected or knew that children were being abused. Father Thomas attributes this apprehension to the workings of the devil. Those who should have moved against these individuals were apathetic or chose not to believe. From 2016 to 2018, 6 Pennsylvania dioceses were the subject of months-long investigation by the state attorney general into sexual abuse claims, many of which went back decades. Father Thomas said, "Convincing people that no one will believe them is what Satan says when something is so outside the bounds of what is reasonable as to be unbelievable. Reading the accounts of what those children in Pennsylvania went through, as detailed in the grand jury report, we wonder, how could this happen? It's otherworldly, outside what people thought was possible. That's what makes it demonic." However, it's not only religious institutions who seem to be under the sway of the devil. In 2021, Angel Almeida, 23, was arrested on gun possession charges. However, he owned more than guns. The detention memo detailed the following, quote, "The investigation has revealed that the defendant posted numerous pictures of himself in possession of the firearm, has association with a violent extremist organization, and also posted material indicative of an interest in violence toward children and animals," end quote. In 2022, he was also charged with child exploitation and enticement of minors. Despite repeated violent behavior in the courtroom, Almeida was found fit to stand trial. He had attacked a Justice Department staffer in the audience and his own court-appointed counsel on separate occasions. As of 2023, he has gone through 4 court-appointed counsel. Wow. very let's keep going with this. The FBI's investigation came across 764, a sinister online group linked to a satanic pedophile extortion cult, which is believed to be an offshoot of the Order of Nine Angels, or O9A, a worldwide Satanist group. The FBI issued a public notice warning of 764's activities, which include deliberate targeting minors on messaging platforms to extort them into recording or live streaming acts of self-harm and producing child sexual abuse material. They use threats, blackmail, and manipulation and operate on different platforms such as Roblox, Discord, Twitch, SoundCloud, and Telegram. Other subgroups that target minors have evolved using different names such as 676, Cult, spelled CVLT, Court, Cascar, Harm Nation, League Society, and they mean hell, but they spell it H3LL. Months after Almeida's arrest in February 2024, court documents confirmed that Kyle Spitz was a member of 764, a satanic pedophile cult. He was charged with sexual exploitation of children. Prior to his arrest, a video went viral of a Tennessee man shooting at Spitz, who was wounded in the ear. The man was his mother's boyfriend. The boyfriend committed suicide after a standoff with police. His mother was later found dead in a hotel room. Spitz's biological father said his son became involved with satanic cults 6 years before when his parents were separating. He was 18 and groomed by a woman who went by the name of Tara, who was 20 years older than him. She convinced Kyle Spitzy to move to Washington, where the grooming continued. Michael Spitz believes his ex-wife died from a heroin overdose, and Kyle had nothing to do with her death. Kyle Spitz operated under the name Criminal on Discord and Telegram. Authorities found a 12-year-old victim who said Spitz demanded porn and self-harm images and videos of her at different times. Prior to this, Kalana Limpkin, Richard Rabbit Densmore, and a Canadian 14-year-old were arrested with a range of charges including child pornography, sexual exploitation, trafficking, animal cruelty, self-harm of minors, and distribution of child pornography featuring self-harm. All of them were members of satanic cults. The DOJ detailed in a motion to keep Kalana Limpkin in prison the following, quote, O9A embraces terrorism, including radical Islamic jihadist ideology and the violent tactics of jihadist groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, as a means to accelerate the decline of Western society, end quote. So if evil individuals are part of groups that blatantly post their beliefs online, how much more sinister are those that operate from the shadows due to their public or private personas? Their intentions are always corruption. Deceit is their vehicle. So in other words, if you look at this, unfortunately, always the targets are children. All right, the corruption of youth, of innocence, really. Because that's when I would say a human being is the most innocent, is when they're children. Corruption of innocence, and whether it's from the church or now these, I would have to say, unfortunately, with the internet, all these, because I really do think that all these occult satanic groups have been around. They just had to keep a very low profile. Now they're out in the open, for lack of a better word, as you can tell on all these different social media platforms. And it's always the same target. Always the same. And what Father Thomas is trying to say is it's not only the ones that perpetrate the crime, it's the apathy, or like people don't want to believe that something like this could actually happen, or believe it. How's that? So food for thought. Disturbing, but unfortunately true. All right. Next story is also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and this is titled Spooky Stull Cemetery. Over 40 years ago, excuse me, a small town in northeast Kansas got the unwanted attention of occultists and vandals when stories started to surface that one of its cemeteries was a hotbed of dark paranormal events. The town of Stull, that's spelled Stull, is separated from the church and cemetery by a highway. The headstones are etched with German surnames such as Stull, Hildenbrand, Bittinger, Wolfkohl, among others. There is one place on the grounds that is supposed to be the portal to hell. And ironically, it's the burned out ruins of an evangelical prairie church, which in truth did not burn down. The church, built in 1867 on an elevated area known as Emmanuel Hill, became vacant in 1922 because it grew too small for the congregation. A new wooden frame church was built across the road. The old church was boarded up. Once abandoned, the limestone structure deteriorated, and the 6 windows and the front door fell away. Trees eventually grew inside the structure. The ruins were supposedly used by Satanists and witches during those years. It stood vacant and falling in on itself. This practice, whether it holds true to the Stull Church, is not unheard of. Supposedly, there were rumors of a long history of occult activities in the area. It wasn't until the 1970s that these stories started to circulate, which is when a wave of interest in demonic stories flourished in the wake of the films Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. Then in 1974, an article authored by Jane Penner appeared in the University Daily Kansas entitled Legend of Devil Hunts Tiny Town. Excuse me. By the way, this newspaper was the university's newspaper. Anyway, quote, far removed from the horrible story of The Exorcist or the bizarre black masses recently discovered in Los Angeles and tucked away on a rough country road between Topeka and Lawrence is the tiny town of Stull. Not unlike the town of Sleepy Hollow, described by Washington Irving in his famous tale, Stull is one of those towns motorists can miss by blinking. Stull and Sleepy Hollow have another thing in common. Both are haunted by legends of diabolical supernatural happenings. According to legend, this graveyard is one of the 2 places on earth where the devil appears in person twice a year. Stull is haunted by legends of diabolical, supernatural happenings told and retold, although it has probably never been recorded. Some people say they heard it from grandparents and great-grandparents, end quote. The book Haunted Kansas describes where a student from Bonner Springs related to the newspaper that her grandmother told her of the devil's annual visit to Stull. Once when driving by the cemetery, she had seen a house that glowed red and seemed to be on fire. A University of Kansas junior told of his experiences in Stull Cemetery. He was accompanied by 2 fraternity brothers, and as they made their way among the tombstones, he felt cold fingers grab his arm. Thinking it was one of his friends, he turned around but found they were standing a distance behind him. The space around him was empty. Another student described going devil hunting in Stull, after which 3 or 4 of them experienced memory lapses. There was also mention of witches gathering in the cemetery. In 1978, about 150 people, most of them university students, gathered at the cemetery to await the arrival of the devil. As noted in an article about the gathering, the only spirits that showed up at Stull Cemetery Monday night during the equinox were in beer cans and liquor bottles. The history that allegedly precedes the building of the church was a story that the people who settled in what would become Stull practiced witchcraft. One woman was hung as a witch from a tree, which would eventually become the graveyard. Halloween is the date when supposedly the devil visits the grave of his infant son or a witch that was the mother of his child. The child makes an appearance as a werewolf. There were other urban myths with unknown origins, but nonetheless fed into the cemetery's eerie reputation. 2 men supposedly were walking in the graveyard when a strong wind blew around them. When they returned to their auto, they found it had moved to the other side of the highway and was facing the opposite direction. Part of the story is that either on Halloween or the spring equinox in February, the 7 gates of hell open up. If you enter, then you cannot return. Which begs the question, why would you try to find this anomaly, much less enter it? In truth, the area that was settled in 1857 by 6 Pennsylvania Dutch farmers was known as Deer Creek until 1899, when the first postmaster was Sylvester Stull, and the town adopted his surname. The post office closed, but the town kept its name. German farmers also settled in the little community. In 1867, the German built the Evangelical Emmanuel Church, where sermons were preached in German. Even into the 20th century, the area was scarcely settled. However, there were a couple of tragedies. In 1908, Oliver Bonmeyer, a toddler, was burned to death in a prairie fire. His father had gone to burn the hayland, and a strong wind was blowing from the south. His two sons, Oliver and his older brother that was 5 years old, followed him, and were caught in a patch of high grass. The older boy was able to climb on top of a stone fence and save himself, but Oliver could not make it. Another tragedy was the discovery of a missing man who had hung himself. In the late 1980s, the words "Kill the Cross" and "Satan" were carved on an interior wall. In those years, at least 500 people would show up on the grounds for Halloween. It got so bad the police would stand guard to make sure they didn't trespass and vandalize the cemetery. Headstones in the cemetery had been broken and toppled. In 1992, the rock group Urge Overkill put out an album titled Stull and used images of the cemetery on the cover. Another tale is connected to dead rock star Kurt Cobain, who supposedly came to the church ruins to break bottles against its wall and scrawl his name. The Bittinger family were the owners, and several of the family members are buried on the grounds. During the 1980s, they owned the Stull bait shop. By 2000, the shop and a nearby auto repair shop had closed. Most of the houses in the town were abandoned, and there were only 20 residents. In 2002, the ruins of the Stull Church came tumbling down. What was mysterious was no one knew who used some type of demolition equipment to push the walls into the middle of the church. The land was owned by Harvest Hills LLC, who had recently bought it from Dennis McCarthy. Major Weiss, one of the members, said he had not authorized it, and he refused to name the other landowners. The prior owner said it needed to be knocked down a long time ago. It's caused a lot of trouble and headaches. It costs the county a lot of money, sending deputies to sit there every Halloween. It costs taxpayers a lot of money for that old church to remain standing. The cemetery caretaker refused to give his name, said he had not been notified of any part of it would be bulldozed. Only the week prior, 4 headstones were knocked over by vandals. Barely 100 tombstones surrounded it. Was it destroyed by Satanists or someone in the town who was tired of the vandalism taking place on the grounds? Later it was revealed that John Haas, who owned the land upon where the church was located, had authorized the demolition after the Douglas County Sheriff's Department informed him that it was a safety risk. In pulp culture, Stull Cemetery has been used in the plots of movies including the villainous character in Turbulence 3 and in the finale of Supernatural's 5th season, in which an apocalyptic confrontation happens on the grounds. In July 2022, the new Stull Church caught fire around 1 p.m. However, the origin was a mystery and was attributed to a lightning strike to the bell tower. There were no injuries reported. Present-day a fence surrounds the cemetery, and you can be fined for entering it when you're not supposed to. The local townspeople help the police patrol. A recent addition to the urban myth is that Mount View Cemetery, also known as Old Stull Cemetery, located just 1 mile south of Stull, is the real Stull Cemetery. Did the otherworldly events attributed to what some might call a decoy really occur here? And you could and surprisingly, this supposedly these visits came from that one article that the university, Jane Penn or whatever, wrote about interviewing people and people, recounting. I was told by my family, my parents, my grandparents, that this was going on there, but it was never officially recorded. And it took on a life of its own. On the flip side of that, if you read through the history, it was never a very densely populated area to begin with. And as time went by, it grew less populated. And which means that I would not be surprised if it is accurate that you would have people going onto the grounds to do occult stuff. Because there was nobody out there. This was not in the middle of a place where a lot of people could see you. It's the middle, basically, of nowhere. And maybe some underground network of information was, hey, that Stull church, because it's known that occultists like to use churches that have been, once, churches that were once churches of some type of Christian, belief, whether it's Protestant or Catholic or whatever. And there was some underground information that, again, less people. And even now, I think there's less than 20 people living there, if that much. So again, it's incredible, though. You know what they say about the power of the pen? There you go. That's the power of the pen. All right. Next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, is titled The Creatures of Sherman Ranch. Sherman Ranch, also known as Skinwalker Ranch, sits on a little over 500 acres just southeast of Ballard, Utah. Sightings of UFOs and several cryptids have been reported. Prior to settlers arriving there, the Ute and Navajos tribes claimed it was used by malevolent witches known as skinwalkers. Situated in the Uinta Basin, Terry Sherman bought this 480-acre property in 1994. The intention of the Sherman family was to run a cattle business. However, unknown to them, this piece of land had a reputation for strange sightings. In 1951, a local teacher named Junior Hicks, along with the students, observed a UFO moving through the skies above the ranch. Junior Hicks then went on to record over 400 individual events of paranormal activity in and around Skinwalker Ranch. During his research, Hicks came across the fact the Ute tribe, which lived in the area, refused to go near this land because they believed it to be cursed. The ranch borders the Uinta and Ouray Indian Reservation. Navajo witches known as, I know I'm mispronouncing this, but Yi Naldalushi frequently used a trail that ran across it. Besides being cannibals and necrophiliacs, these Navajo witches had the ability to shapeshift. Skinwalker translated from Navajo is equivalent to, by means of it, it goes on all fours. Legend says the Navajo unleashed the Skinwalkers on their enemies, the Utes, during a time of hostility, but like many weapons, once set free, they could not be recalled. According to the book Being and Becoming Ute, quote, it was not a friendly relationship. The Navajo were more aggressive people. They took slaves and they had Ute slaves. There was direct conflict when the Navajo attempted to move up into Ute territory, end quote. The land had been considered dangerous for hundreds of years. A ridgeline directly behind Skinwalker Ranch was given the nickname Werewolf Ridge by the locals for reasons lost to history. In 1776, Franciscan missionary Silvestre Vélez de Escalante wrote about strange fireballs popping over his campfire. In El Rey, while the Revolutionary War was fought by colonists against Great Britain, two Catholic priests established a few missions among the Pueblo tribes and crossed into Utah near what is now Dinosaur National Monument. In December 1910, new settlers who were in the area to inspect lands they purchased at the Provo government sale noticed rumblings that sounded like explosions or distant thunder sound out at intervals during the day and night. Homesteaders had heard the muffled detonations for the past 5 years since the Uinta Indian Reservation opened to settlement. Established as an agricultural homestead in 1905, Kenneth and Edith Myers bought the land in 1934. Here we're talking about the Skinwalker Ranch. They made a small homestead on the property's northwest corner. This was right below Skinwalker Ridge, supposedly one of the most active parts of the property. The Myers abandoned the small homestead and moved to a home on the eastern side of the ranch. According to Mr. Hicks, the family never reported any unusual experiences, but their neighbors did. The next owners were the Shermans. In 1975, Dr. Frank Salisbury wrote an article for Bioscience related to an investigation he had undertaken of several UFO sightings that came out during the 1960s and covered the area of the Uinta Basin. Dr. Salisbury was a plant physiologist and for a time headed the Utah State University Department of Plant Science. These weird happenings continued after Salisbury published his findings. He authored the Utah UFO Display, published in 1974. He used data from the files of Joseph Jr. Hicks, and the foreword was written by J. Allen Hynek. In the book is a Q&A between Salisbury and Garth Myers. the brother of Kenneth Myers, who bought the ranch in 1933. The Myers initially bought 160 acres and added parcels of land as time went by. Salisbury also participated in a symposium titled Encounters with UFO Beings in 1977. When Terry and Gwen Sherman bought the ranch, it had been abandoned and they had difficulty tracking down who had been the previous owners. When inspecting the structures, they were mystified to find deadbolt locks on the doors and windows, as well as the cabinets inside the kitchen. At both ends of the house, iron stakes and heavy chains had been installed. Terry Sherman guessed the previous tenants had positioned large guard dogs in the front and back of the home, but he had no idea why. It did not take long for the Sherman family to start experiencing paranormal activity of all different types. They heard mysterious voices not only inside the home but around the property as well. They had UFO sightings, cryptids, and poltergeist activity inside the home. They owned 80 head of cattle, and in the span of 2 years, 14 of them were mutilated. When Terry Sherman asked other ranchers about slaughter of the cows, they confirmed that their own cattle had been mutilated in the past, and that the local authorities hadn't been able to help. It started on the first day as they were moving in. They had an encounter with a large wolf that allowed the family to pet it. Lulled into a false sense of security, shortly thereafter, it attacked a small calf. They shot at the creature with a handgun and shotgun, and it would not let go of the calf. Eventually, it walked off into the woods uninjured, and when Terry Sherman tracked it into the woods, its prints just disappeared. Another time, Gwen Sherman drove into the ranch in her Chevette. She encountered a wolf that stood taller than her car. This would be one of several times the family ran across larger than normal wolves on their land. There were times the beams of light could be seen dancing around the land from sky to ground. There were times when the family discovered large holes and crop circles throughout the land. The phenomena was not limited to sights and sounds, but smells as well. Occasionally, a musky odor would waft through the house. At other times, the sound of running machinery would be heard coming up from the ground the house stood on. Nearby farmers witnessed blue orbs flying around above the ranch. The family claimed that there seemed to be some type of intelligence behind the orbs and that they were quite frightening. Eventually, the family ended up sleeping together in one room. UFOs sighted in the area came in all shapes and sizes. Some looked spherical, others just like orange balls of light, and some resembled an RV. One time their dogs followed the orbs into the brush. The family heard the dogs howl in pain, and the next day they were discovered incinerated. This was the event that prompted the Shermans to put the property up for sale. One of the mysteries, among many, is a lack of information given by the Myers family, who ranched there for 60 years. It's hard to believe the claim they never experienced or saw anything unusual. However, Garth Myers, who inherited the property and subsequently sold it to Bigelow, said his family never witnessed any UFO phenomena. Garth Myers inherited the property and sold it to the Shermans because when his brother and his widow they died, it went to him. He was the younger brother, and they had no children, so he was the one that sold it to the Shermans. It took 2 years for the family to have their fill of all the strange occurrences, and they sold the property to Robert Bigelow for $200,000. Just a year earlier, in 1995, he had founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, to fund research on UFOs and the paranormal. He had been spurred into purchasing the ranch due to the anecdotal sightings of UFOs, Bigfoot-like creatures, crop circles, glowing orbs, and poltergeist activity reported by the Shermans. Despite their horrific experiences, the new owners of Skinwalker Ranch convinced the Shermans to remain on the ranch as caretakers for a few more years to aid in observing and documenting unexplained events. If they had any doubt about what the Shermans had described, they didn't have long to wait. The first night, they witnessed yellow orbs 20 feet off the ground. They saw an animal that appeared human-like climb to the top of a tree. They tried to kill it, suspecting it was responsible for the mutilations, but just like the wolf the Shermans shot at, it was unharmed. It ran off into the snow, leaving human-like footprints with large claw marks. NIDS continued with the research. Several cattle were mutilated. It was observed that it was done very quickly and with an extremely sharp object. Incredibly, in some instances, researchers were only 300 yards away when the mutilations took place. Examination of the carcasses found they had been drained of blood, and 40% of the mass inside the animal had been removed. The researchers, like the Shermans, experienced UFO sightings, different types of cryptids around the ranch, poltergeist activity, and other paranormal events. After 7 years, they had documented 100 separate incidents. The documentation, however, did not include any film or photographs. It eluded their cameras and recording devices, and whatever was there always seemed to be one step ahead of the researchers. They stopped research on the ranch in 2004, but maintained ownership of the property until 2016. Supposedly, this was done since paranormal events had died down, and the staff were hoping that without the constant observation they had placed the property under, the phenomena would resume. Humans who have lived or visited the ranch have not been harmed physically, but psychologically instead. In some instances, some researchers said they saw a smiling or smirking wolf outside their homes, which were on the other side of the country from the Utah ranch. In 2005, Colm Keller and George Knapp wrote a book titled Hunt for the Skinwalker. Keller worked for Robert Bigelow, the owner of Budget Suites of America and Bigelow Aerospace. In September 2018, a documentary was released based on the book. The documentary further revealed that the Department of Defense primarily funded the study. On the night of March 12, 1997, Colm Keller described the following, quote, "The large creature that lay motionless, almost casually in the tree. The only indication of the beast's presence was the penetrating yellow light of the unblinking eyes as they stared fixedly back into the light. It was then that I saw it. A single obvious oval track, about 6 inches in diameter, embedded deeply in the patch of snow. It looked unusual. A single large print in the snow with 2 sharp claws protruding from the rear of the mark, going a couple of inches deeper. It almost looked like a bird of prey, maybe a raptor print, but huge, and from the depth of the print, from a very heavy creature. He noticed the tracks after firing at the figure." Bigelow's team claimed they never captured any concrete proof of the weird phenomena that takes place here. However, they have failed to disclose what they did observe even to the team that works for the new owner. Brandon Fugel, a real estate developer and tech investor, announced ownership of the ranch via Adamantium Real Estate in 2020, even though they had secured ownerships since 2016. Starting in 2020, the History Channel started to record a reality TV show on the property titled The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. Like the NIDS team, they have malfunctioning electronic equipment and unexplained illnesses suddenly afflicting team members when visiting certain areas of the ranch. Strange things seem to follow the participants home. Many of them experience vertigo and nausea. In some cases, those who have investigated the ranch have experienced what is called the hitchhiker phenomena. In an interview, Dr. Travis Taylor said, quote, "We don't like to talk about the hitchhiker too much because everybody's afraid it's going to trigger it or something. I have several colleagues that were putting instruments out to measure things at their houses as well as at the ranch, and we're measuring simultaneous events occurring at both places. This may be 1,000 miles apart. It just happened to me. My brand new car, so it just shuts off suddenly. All the lights start blinking on and off, and crazy, which we've seen happen at the ranch, and something was going on at the same time at the ranch." End quote. Fugel says he has not experienced whatever it is has followed them home, and in some cases, oops, and in some cases terrorized their families. Participants, including military operatives, refused to set foot on the property again due to the negativity of what occurred to them. Fugel said even Mr. Bigelow has had experiences that have followed him, resulting in his refusal to ever visit the property ever again. Present day, the property is closed to the public, and security is high due to the high amount of trespassing and vandalism that has taken place. Paranormal activity on the property has all but disappeared over the past couple of years. The mysteries, however, still remain. So, obviously, this, and supposedly, the Myers who lived there for 60 years, like They bought it like in 1933. They said they started with 160 acres and then they spread out. The story is that they lived there, they ranched there for 60 years, and they say they never saw any UFOs, none of this weird things, cryptids or nothing. And of course, both of them have passed on. I think the wife was passed on in 1994. And the one remaining relative, Garth Myers, who sold the property to the Shermans, he says no, my brother and his wife, they never saw anything. But then everybody else, the neighbors and even teachers and everybody is saying, hey, for years we've been seeing all this activity, so where does the truth lie? Very interesting. I've been watching the show and I like the approach that they're trying to do, which is to verify through scientific means. But there's a lot of weird stuff going on over there. Next story is out of Mysterious Universe and is titled Disturbing Tales of Battles and Standoffs with Apparent Invaders from Another World. It is safe to say that the majority of UFO and alien encounters, cases of alien abductions aside, unfold from a distance, with the brief sightings of strange aerial objects or even bizarre-looking humanoids from afar. Furthermore, these sightings are by and large peaceful and without incident. There are, though, some encounters that go beyond even alien abduction, and certainly beyond sightings of strange lights in the distance. These encounters have descended into armed standoff between the respective witnesses and otherworldly creatures. What makes some of these incidents even more remarkable and fascinating is that they bleed heavily into other areas of interest, such as cryptid creatures and the world of the supernatural. Without a doubt, one of the strangest and most terrifying of these encounters occurred in the summer of 1981 in Rome, Ohio. Over several months, 40 investigator Dennis Pilches documented the bizarre events in his book Night Siege, the Northern Ohio UFO Creature Invasion, witnessing many of the strange incidents himself. These strange events were a fascinating blend of UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot-type creatures, and even hints of the supernatural. By the time Pilches arrived at the Ohio farm, the owner, Robert, along with his family, had been subject to the bizarre goings-on for several months. Although no one realized it at the time, the strange events actually began early in 1981, when the family found a dead deer on their land, its body shredded by something with sharp claw-like hands. However, it was several months later, in May, when the disturbing happenings began to truly unfold. At the time, a group of Amish men approached Robert and asked for permission to go chop wood from the woodland around his farm, something that Robert agreed to. With them, they brought their work horses, as well as several large bags of horse feed, which they left at the site where they were working each night. One morning, however, when they arrived to continue their work, they discovered each of the bags completely ripped open as if by a wild animal in a frenzied attack. The following day, Robert clearly heard several gunshots coming from where the Amish men were working. He waited for the group to leave at the end of the day, at which point he noticed them carrying out the dead body of one of their horses, its body ravaged with claw-like gashes. Robert approached them to ask what had happened. However, the men didn't wish to speak and said simply that they had been shooting at snakes. The group continued their work on the site for several more days, a new horse in place, before they suddenly left the area without warning, leaving behind all of their equipment. They eventually returned for it a month later, but they refused to speak about what they had encountered and why they had left so suddenly. By this time, it was June 1981, and work that had been started the previous winter on a gas line on Robert's land was due to be completed. As one of the workers on the project was clearing land in the woods where the pipeline was due to be placed, they came across a 40-foot square patch of land that was completely and utterly barren, almost unnaturally so, with no grass, vegetation, or even rocks being present. Even stranger, the worker discovered 4 holes the size of a 50-gallon drum in the ground, within the parameters of the circle. Despite the strangeness of the patch of land, the worker continued with the laying of the pipeline right through the barren patch. Whether coincidence or not, shortly after this things began to turn decidedly disturbing for Robert and his family. The first of these unsettling events unfolded on the morning of June 15th, when Robert discovered that four of his ducks and one of his chickens were missing. He found their ripped up carcasses several hours later in the nearby woodland. Each of the ducks had had their heads completely bitten or torn off. In fact, the more Robert studied the bloody remains, the more he had the distinct feeling that they had been killed more for pleasure than for food. Even more concerning was the impression of a claw-like hand or foot on the ground beside the dead birds. Although the discovery profoundly shook him, he kept the incident to himself and didn't tell his family. Only days later, though, Robert's 16-year-old son would find himself at the center of these ever stranger events. On the night in question, late in the evening, the teenager woke and began screaming in terror. Everyone else in the house immediately rushed to his bedroom and found the young boy agitated and in a state of shock. When they had managed to calm him, he offered that he had awoke to see a strange face of a bizarre creature looking straight at him through his bedroom window. Although they believed he definitely thought he had seen something, his parents suggested he had likely suffered an intense nightmare, eventually convincing the young boy of this. Robert, though, knew better. Several days later, on the evening of June 25th, the entire family heard the sudden agitated and anxious sounds of their ducks outside. Robert, along with his sons, went outside to investigate. Robert located his ducks with his flashlight and then began sweeping the beam around the yard. Then it illuminated the shape of something kind of black, formed with two big glowing red eyes. At that point, one of the boys aimed his flashlight at the creature, and Robert opened fire, squeezing off a single shot. A moment later, the creature let out a bizarre scream and ran off into the darkness, continuing to scream as it did, a scream that Robert later described as switching between a bizarre high-pitched whine and a low-pitched moan. He also stated the creature was at least 8 feet tall, and perhaps most unsettling of all, when it scurried away, it did so on two legs and not on all fours. Needless to say, the entire family remained awake for most of the night in case the creature returned. Although it didn't do that night, the following evening the unnerving events continued. It was around 2 a.m. in the early hours of June 27th when the family dogs certainly started barking frantically, dragging Robert's attention away from the television. He immediately reached for his flashlight and went to the back door. As soon as he opened it, he could see the dog pressed against the lawnmower, clearly frightened and attempting to conceal itself. He moved the beam of the flashlight in front of him. Then he could see a form that he likened to a gorilla standing in the yard. Once more Robert could make out the glowing red eyes, and even worse, they were looking straight back at him. He also became aware of a snorting and growling sound that seemed to be coming from the creature. The more he looked at this monstrous shadowy figure, the more he realized it was much taller than 8 feet, standing closer to 12 feet in height. Perhaps worst of all, though, were the fang-like teeth showing in its mouth. Confronted with such a sight, Robert felt waves of fear washing over him. In fact, he later stated that he was in such a state that he feared he might have a heart attack. He immediately turned around and headed back inside, calling out to his sons as he did so. He retrieved his shotgun, all the while listening to the creature's movements outside. By the time his sons reached the living room and Robert had opened the front door, they could all hear bizarre screaming sounds as the mysterious beast ran back into the night. Robert told his sons to get in their pickup truck. No sooner were all three inside the vehicle than Robert was speeding off in pursuit of the curious creature. Only moments later, they spotted it near the woodland that surrounded the farm. Robert immediately floored the gas pedal towards it. They would, though, lose sight of the creature around half a mile down the road. At this point, Robert realized they were close to their neighbor's property. He drove to the neighbor's house and, despite it being so late in the evening, knocked on the door to inquire if they had seen anything strange or out of the ordinary recently. They said they hadn't, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, Robert and the boys were back in their truck on their way home. Robert drove slowly, though, and each of the side windows was wound down as they all scanned their moving surroundings in case they spotted the bizarre figure once more. Then, with no warning and for no apparent reason, the truck's engine suddenly faltered. As his two sons kept watch, Robert went out to investigate. The tank was almost full of petrol, and the truck's electric still worked. The headlights remained on, for example, so he was at a loss as to what had caused the engine to fail. As this was happening, the trio saw another vehicle heading down the road from another one of their neighbors. When they spotted Robert, they slowed down and offered assistance, which Robert gladly accepted. As they worked to get the engine started, Robert told the neighbor of the truly strange and disturbing events that had taken over their lives. Then the sound of something walking in the trees and long grass on the side of the road brought both men to full attention. They remained silent for several moments, but no further sounds came. It was at this point when the neighbor offered his own family that his own family had undergone a similar mystifying encounter. He stated that his sons had recently decided to camp out in the yard one evening. After several hours, though, late into the night, they suddenly came bursting into the house, claiming there had been something outside their tent that had made ungodly growling noises. The boys and their father contemplated if a bear had wandered onto their land temporarily, but whatever it was, the boys now refused to go outside the house at night. As the men were speaking, Robert made several attempts to restart the truck. Then, for no reason Robert could determine, it suddenly started up as if there had never been a problem. They bid goodbye to their neighbor and set off back home. However, all three of them were now fully alert and remained so throughout the night. The strange events, though, were just getting started. The entire family had planned to go out to attend a show on the evening of June 28th. However, due to the recent events, they opted to remain home and keep watch over the property. And their concerns were proven well-founded during the evening as they spotted the dark, shadowy figure moving around in the trees at the edge of their land. Only now there was not only one, but several, all moving around as if sizing up the property and the family. For reasons largely unknown to themselves, in part because of a sudden surge of anger at the curious events, Robert and both of his sons picked up their guns and ventured outside. The youngest son driving a tractor, with Robert and the eldest son walking, one on each side, stopping in the field near the trees where the menacing figures were moving. From their position, they could see that at least one of the creatures was holding a dark blue light of some kind. They immediately aimed their weapons at the light. However, before any of them could pull the trigger, it suddenly went out as if anticipating their intention. As soon as the light went out, multiple pairs of glowing red eyes were suddenly visible in the trees. Without speaking a word to each other, all three of them raised their weapons once more and opened fire. The barrage was prolonged, lasting for several moments, using 2 full boxes of ammunition. After bringing the assault to a halt, the three of them could see that one of the figures appeared to be lying on the ground a short distance away, close to the pond. They opened fire once more. This time, though, in response to the gunfire, they could see the multiple pairs of red eyes moving lower to the ground as if those they belonged to were taking cover. Then one of the pairs of eyes began to move. It was heading in the direction of their target. They each looked on in shock as it appeared one of the figures grabbed the creature on the ground before taking them both into the pond, where they now took cover. They quickly flashed the beams of their flashlights across the water, but neither of the figures was visible. Realizing their guns were of minimal use to them and that they didn't appear deadly for the creatures, they decided to head back to the house. Once there, they reloaded their weapons and ventured onto the roof, where they could keep watch for the night. It was around this time, just after the pond incident, that investigator Dennis Pilchis arrived at the property. He sensed straight away that there was an authenticity to the family's claims. He could see, for example, ladders propped against the walls to access the roof, not to mention the makeshift sniper's nest on the roof itself. There was also multiple spent shell casings scattered around the property, and perhaps most amazing of all were the several footprints he found in the fields around the house, which Pilchis described as large circular footprints with 3 toe-like extensions. After examining the positioning of these footprints, Pilchis estimated that whatever made them likely had a 6-foot stride. He also noticed another bizarre and quite surreal detail. The footprints would continue so far before stopping and disappearing, and then reappearing again a short distance ahead, seemingly suggestive of the figure leaping or even somehow transporting themselves several feet ahead. After speaking with the family and examining as many details of the incidents as he could, he determined that the family was not dealing with one set of strange entities, but 2. He offered that the dark shadowy figures who sometimes held the dark blue lights and the creatures with the glowing red eyes were 2 separate but somehow connected entities. During his investigations over several weeks, he would eventually see these entities for himself. He further noted how the figures with the blue lights often appeared to have a soft white glow around them, writing that these strange light sources and mysterious black forms are a common thread among many UFO creature encounters. One particular evening, not long after Pellicer arrived at the farm, he and his team, along with the family, witnessed a thought-provoking incident that perhaps further suggested UFO activity was connected to the strange events the family was experiencing. From the roof, as they kept watch over the woods, the entire group witnessed the trees suddenly light up as bright as day, in a pure and clear white color. The light remained for around 5 minutes before suddenly disappearing. Another evening of bizarre encounters unfolded on June 29th, with the events resulting in 2 official police reports of the strange going-ons. 2 calls were placed to the police, one at 5 p.m. and one at 11 p.m., with a search of the property by a responding team revealing several huge footprints, as well as various ground disturbance. In other words, someone or something had definitely been on the farm on the night in question. Only 2 nights later, the intensity of events increased even more. On the evening of July 1st, the 2 members of the family on the roof of the main house noticed 4 strange, evenly spaced spherical lights hovering a short distance above the trees at the edge of their land. They watched as the lights changed colors, from red to blue to yellow. Then, though they changed to a color that they had not seen before, and therefore struggled to describe, offering that it was most similar to black. Things turned even stranger when a beam of white light came from one of the spheres. As soon as it hit the ground, the entire area lit up brightly. Then a chilling scream rang out once more. After several moments, the lights suddenly went out, and a moment after that, the pair could see the black, shadowy forms moving closer to the edge of the trees. The pair immediately raised their guns and opened fire, noting that with each shot, a scream rang out from the woodland. This standoff continued throughout the night, with the encounters with the red eyes appearing deep in the trees and remaining there for the duration. By contrast, the dark, shadowy figures appeared to intentionally approach the edge of the trees, almost as if they were trying to create some kind of distraction. In fact, during one of these episodes, with the shadowy entities right at the edge of the woodland, the figures with the glowing red eyes made their way to the vegetation at the side of the barn. The 2 men on the roof noticed their approach and opened fire on them. As they expected, the strange beings ran back into the trees, screaming as they did so. As strange and unsettling as these events undoubtedly were, however, one incident during the night was particularly disturbing and perplexing. At some point during the middle of the night, with the dark creatures and glowing red-eyed entities still seemingly watching them from the trees, the 2 men on the roof noticed their horse standing in the middle of the field. Only they knew it couldn't be their horse, as their horse was secured in the barn. Pellicer later wrote that they knew something was wrong, and even though it was their horse, it was not their horse. Certain that whatever they were looking at wasn't their horse, the pair opened fire. The bullets hit their target. However, instead of dropping to the ground, the horse began to scream. Then it began to growl. Then right before their eyes it morphed into one of the dark creatures and ran into cover in the trees, screaming as it did so. The pair had the realization that not only could these creatures seemingly change their form, but they were also attempting to lure them from the roof. By 3:30 a.m., all the members of the family and Pellicer's investigative team were on the roof looking out over the fields and trees. Out of nowhere, a strange glowing object suddenly appeared a short distance away, hovering just above one of the fields close to the house. All on the roof watched the craft, clearly fascinated by it. Then the youngest son claimed that a beam of light had come from the object and hit him and caused him to fall. Just prior to him making this claim, he had indeed fallen forward, with another member of the family having to catch him and steady his balance. Whatever had happened, the young boy suffered from an intense headache for the next 24 hours. The bizarre and unsettling events of that night, though, were still not over. At around 4:30 a.m., around an hour after the glowing object appeared hovering over the field, a second object that looked similar to a red, hot coal began descending into the nearby trees, landing in one of the clearings. Once more the family raised their weapons aimed them at the object, and opened fire. As the bullet hit their target, the object rose slightly and then changed its shape. As it fell back to the ground, it became some kind of animal-like creature, something like an owl. As this was happening, the family continued to fire their weapons. Then, all on the rooftop looked on in complete shock as the creature got up and ran down the wood line on all fours. They waited several moments before venturing down from the roof and toward the area where the object had turned into something else. Once there, they discovered an impression that looked like something heavy had fallen to the ground there. The night's strange activity finished with one more peculiar event. As a family and investigative team were exploring the grounds, a box-shaped object passed overhead, approximately 200 feet above them. The witnesses looked up and could see a red light on the underside of the craft with a blue light around it. Robert raised his weapon and fired in the direction of the object. They all heard a sound like breaking glass, and at the same time the red light went out, suggesting that Robert's shot had been on target. The object then moved off into the distance and disappeared out of sight. The evening of July 3rd would bring with it further strange events. As usual, Robert and his family were positioned on the rooftop, keeping watch over the woodland when a strange fog suddenly appeared out of nowhere and closed in on them. However, although they couldn't explain how or why, this fog appeared to be contained only to the main house and the area around it, and was so thick the family couldn't see past several feet. The following day, Pellicer examined the fields around the house and discovered further strange footprints, some of which appeared to have 5 toes, suggesting a third type of creature. Even stranger, around these 5-toed footprints, the grass appeared to swirl around in an anti-clockwise direction, something that Pellicer could not even begin to suggest an explanation for. These events continued, with Pellicer and a colleague, William McIntyre, finding themselves confronted by one of the shadowy entities one July evening. On the night in question, the 2 men were working near the edge of the field, investigating the trees before returning to the main house. However, out of nowhere, a glowing form stepped out of the woods. The family saw the figure from their position on the rooftop and opened fire on it immediately. It fell to the ground a short distance ahead of Pellicer and McIntyre. The 2 men, along with the other members of the family, ran over to where the figure had dropped. However, upon arriving, although there was a definite impression in the vegetation where the figure had fallen, the figure itself was no longer there. Even more remarkable, a makeshift path was visible in the long grass leading away from them, suggesting that whatever the shadowy figure was, it had seemingly dragged itself through the vegetation and back into the woods. The 2 investigators decided to throw a rock into the trees in an attempt to locate where the creature might be. However, several moments after they had done so, the rock came hurtling back toward them, landing only a short distance from where the group was standing. At this point, the group also noted the now familiar pair of glowing red eyes appearing in the trees. They were seemingly heading to the same point, most likely where the figure had dragged itself. A little shaken by the whole affair, the family investigators returned to the house and watched over the woodland for the rest of the night from the rooftop. The pair of red eyes, moved constantly throughout the trees, and every now and then one of the shadowy figures would emerge out of the woodland to the edge of the field, remaining there for several moments before returning into the shadows once more. As bizarre as the events were at the small farm in Rome, Ohio, as part of his investigation, Pellicer learned of other strange and concerning encounters from other locations in the same area. A nearby Rock Creek, for example, near midnight one Friday night in July 1981, a young man was taking a shortcut along an old railroad as he made his way home after visiting his grandmother. Although the tracks themselves had been removed years previously, the path of the railroad remained, providing easy access between the 2 locations. As he was walking, the young man began hearing strange grunting sounds coming from the trees at each side of the track. To begin with, he tried to ignore the strange sounds. However, when he heard them coming directly from behind him, he instinctively turned around to confront whatever was approaching, He wasn't at all ready for the sight that confronted him. There in front of him, no more than 20 feet away, was a big, black, ugly, hairy creature that was around 9 feet tall and had the overall appearance of an overgrown gorilla with long arms hanging below the waist and real long legs. The creature was so large and appeared so strong that the young man quickly reasoned that the rifle he was carrying would be of little use to him, and declined to attempt to fire at the bizarre beast. He did, though, turn and run as fast as he could. As he did, he could clearly hear the creature following him. He recalled it was not running, but rather walking at an increased heavy pace. He continued to run for several moments before he was forced to stop briefly to catch his breath. When he stopped, although the creature was still making grunting noises, it had also stopped. The witness reasoned with himself that if the creature had wished to attack him, it would have done so then. With this in mind, instead of running once more, he returned to face the mysterious beast. It was standing there around 15 feet from him, but was showing no signs of advancing on him. It made a grunting sound toward the witness, however, which caused him to turn and run once more. Once more the creature began to follow, still walking fast instead of running. By pure chance the witness happened past a pathway carved into the cornfield at the side of the railroad, made by himself and other locals riding their bikes through the fields many times. He turned into this makeshift path and ran down it as quickly as he could. When he stopped and looked back, he could see that the creature had continued past the pathway and was carrying on down the old railroad. We might question whether the creature simply decided to break off the pursuit, or whether it was bound by laws and reasons we don't understand to remain along the railroad. Whatever the truth might be, the same witness had another bizarre encounter with this beast-like entity. After telling several of his friends of the strange incident, they all returned to the old railroad several days later to see if the curious creature returned, and much to their surprise it did. After having only been there for several minutes, each of them could hear the strange grunting and heavy breathing sounds coming from the woodlands around them. Before they realized what was happening, the beastly creature appeared a short distance ahead of them on the old track. One of the boys was so panicked by its sudden appearance that before he realized what he had done, he raised his gun and fired at it. It fell to the ground and remained there for several moments before dragging itself back to its feet. It then ran back into the trees, a blood-curdling scream coming from it as it did so. Incidentally, when Pellicer performed background checks on the witness, he found that he was widely respected in his community and not someone who was likely to become involved in some kind of hoax. Furthermore, perhaps adding further credibility to the young man's account, was that several people who lived in properties that were positioned along the old railroad had also heard strange high-pitched sounds coming from the woods near the tracks. Investigators explored the old track for themselves and were amazed to find several three-toed impressions in different locations. The events at the rural farm in Rome, Ohio, continued for the duration of the summer, stretching into late 1981, before suddenly coming to a stop. While these truly mysterious events remain unexplained, there are several intriguing details to consider, not least just who the strange creature that terrorized the family for such a prolonged period might have been. We might recall that Pellicer believed that there was at least two different creatures behind the encounters, and perhaps even a third when we factor in the five-toed footprint impression the team discovered. It is also interesting to recall the night the family was on the roof and witnessed the figures with glowing red eyes appearing at the side of the house as if attempting to create a distraction. Although it isn't said outright, the descriptions of these creatures with the red eyes are very similar to those of Bigfoot creatures. We should also consider that many UFO researchers have offered that there appears to be a definite connection between UFO sightings and encounters of Bigfoot, with UFO hotspots also being home to multiple reports of the elusive creature. One such researcher was John Keel, who offered that the intelligence behind UFOs could very well send out Bigfoot creatures by way of creating a distraction. Was Keel perhaps closer to the truth than even he might have thought, and was this the case here? It is further interesting to note these menacing creatures apparent ability to change their form, we might call it morphing into the family's horse in an attempt to lure them into the field. With that in mind, might we also consider that the dark shadowy figures and the creatures with the glowing red eyes were the same entity manifested in two different ways? It is certainly a possibility, one that adds yet another layer to these already nuanced events. There is at least one other incident on record that shares some remarkable similarities to the events in Rome, Ohio. In the summer of 1981, although it didn't happen over weeks, a very similar encounter unfolded almost 3 decades earlier in Kentucky. Around 8 p.m. on the evening of August 21st, 1955, the Sutton family were entertaining their guests, the Taylor family, who had traveled from Pennsylvania in their out-of-the-way farmhouse around 8 miles from the small town of Hopkinsville. One of the Taylor family, Billy Ray, had left the house to fetch water from a well a short distance away. As he did so, he noticed a strange-looking glowing object in the sky that appeared to be on fire with all the colors of the rainbow. He continued to watch as the object descended, eventually landing just behind some nearby trees. At this point, Billy Ray rushed back to the main house, immediately blurting out that he had seen a flying saucer to the Suttons and his wife June. After looking up at Billy Ray for several moments, those in the house simply went back to their chatter, used to Billy Ray's strange sense of humor. However, when the family dog began to bark frantically, suggesting that something was outside, they immediately ventured into the porch to investigate, letting the dog out in the process. Instead of speeding into the trees to see what was approaching, however, the dog crawled under the house, clearly frightened. All returned inside and shut the door, each venturing to the windows of the house to peer inside, into the dark night. As they did so, the frightened whines of the dog beneath them were clearly audible. Eventually, Billy Ray and the Suttons' eldest son, Lucky, decided to go outside to investigate further. Several moments after stepping outside, Lucky noticed a strange green glowing object heading in their direction. He called out, alerting the others to the strange glowing presence. As it got closer to the property, all could tell that the glowing form was a small humanoid figure. They watched as the figure continued its slow, steady approach. Then it suddenly became aware of the family watching it. It immediately threw its arms high into the air and burst towards the house with great speed. A moment later, Lucky and Billy Ray raised their guns and opened fire. Although the shots hit their target, all the bullets achieved was flipping the creature over. It quickly got back to its feet and ran off back into the woodland. Perplexed, the two men began back inside the house. As they did, they noticed another goblin creature staring into the property through a side window. Once more, both men unleashed several shots from their weapons, and once more, despite hitting the creature square on, it was merely stunned as opposed to wounded. Like the first creature, quickly recovered from the shots and ran off into the shadows of the trees. Realizing there was more than one of these strange creatures near the property, Billy Ray, with Lucky covering him, headed toward the back door. After only a step or two, however, a claw reached down from above and grabbed his hair. There above them on the roof was one of the goblin-like creatures, its silver-like suit now evident. Lucky raised his gun and fired. The bullet made a metallic ping upon impacting the creature, which simply floated to the ground and vanished into the night. As the two men made their way back to the house, they noticed several green glows moving around in the woodland. They quickly noticed another of the creatures in one of the nearby trees, and yet another on the roof of another building nearby. Each time the two men opened fire on the creatures, and each time they simply walked away unscathed. Then all of a sudden, it appeared the strange, menacing being simply disappeared. Taking their chance, the two men quickly ushered the respective families into their vehicles and screeched away from the property towards Hopkinsville Police Station. It was around 11 p.m. by the time the two cars arrived at the station. The families rushed inside, insisting that they needed help and that they had been fighting strange creatures for hours. Despite the strangeness of the story, the police agreed to send several officers with the family back to the property so they could investigate. It was clear from the state of sheer panic the two families were in that whatever it was, they had certainly seen something. Upon arriving at the property and investigating the area for themselves, while one officer believed he saw a strange glowing in the woods, none of the officers saw the strange creatures for themselves. They were, though, concerned enough to contact nearby Fort Campbell for military assistance. The military arrived and carried out a significant sweep of the area, but found nothing. Eventually, the police and the military left the two families to return to the farmhouse. A short time later, the menacing creatures did likewise. The two terrified families spent the next several hours engaged with the mysterious entities before, at around 5 a.m., they simply disappeared once more, this time for good. By the time a report appeared in the Kentucky New Era newspaper the following day, the small and once quiet farmhouse became the focus of UFO and paranormal investigators across America. As we might imagine, with this increased focus came increased scrutiny. This scrutiny resulted in both the Sutton and Taylor families beginning to pull back from any publicity, tired of the ridicule and accusations of orchestrating a hoax. In their book Close Encounter at Kelly, Isabel Davis and Ted Blocker documented how Billy Ray took the brunt of the accusations of the incident being a hoax, largely for no other reason than he saw the spaceship land in the woods before the battle unfolded. What perhaps aided these suspicions was that Billy Ray, unlike the other witnesses, was more than happy to speak to anyone who would listen of the events that August evening. Whether or not Billy Ray was simply happy to speak of the incident, or whether he did indeed see an opportunity to benefit financially from the bizarre events, accusations of a hoax fall on shaky ground when we consider the events that followed and continued for several hours, events that were witnessed by multiple people. There have been many suggestions put forward to explain the bizarre events that evening. Perhaps one of the most intriguing is that the family was attacked not by invaders from another world, but by an aggressive pair of local great horned owls. This explanation remained seemingly valid for some time, with proponents of it offering how the appearance of this breed of owl matched almost exactly the description given by the Sutton and Taylor families. However, in his book Unexplained, Jerome Clark confronted this apparent explanation. He highlighted, for example, that the witnesses had recalled the sound they heard when firing their weapons at the creatures, resembling bullets striking a metal bucket, certainly not the sound they would make striking an owl. Clark also highlighted how investigators had discovered an odd luminous patch near the fence where one of the creatures had been shot. A similar substance was also found along the pathway, in the direction the creature had fled. Ultimately, Clark offered that investigators by police, Air Force officers from nearby Fort Campbell, and civilian ufologists found no evidence of a hoax. The incident remains of interest to UFO and paranormal investigators and researchers today, over half a century later. Could it really be that the goblin-like creatures that terrorized the two families on the farm in rural Kentucky were the same creatures, albeit in a different form, as those who unleashed several weeks of terror on the family at the rural farm in Ohio 2.5 decades later? There are many other examples on record of apparent battles between people and entities from another world. We have examined before, for example, the claims of John Edmonds at Stardust Ranch. Although many caution that the claims should be treated with a pinch of salt, he claimed to have faced a similar prolonged standoff to the family in Rome, Ohio, with creatures he claimed were from another dimension attempting to gain access to his property, as well as abducting himself and his wife. Edmonds claimed he fought back against these abductions, killing several of these creatures before they dematerialized into their own dimension. Although the circumstances and details are different to our previous encounters, the events surrounding Benedito Campos and Silvia Marie from Brazil are worth exploring here. It is another account that I relay from the deep within the archives of UFO Insight, history's most bizarre, outlandish, and controversial UFO and alien encounters, and took place during one of the most active UFO waves Brazil has ever seen. The incident unfolded in the small town of Mosqueiro on the evening of October 29, 1977. At around 6 p.m. on the evening in question, Benedito Campos and his wife Silvia Marie were sitting in their living room when the pair spotted a strange oval shape, a strange oval object appear in the sky through their window. As it moved, a green laser type beam came from the underside of the object and stretched to the ground. Several moments later, with the pair still watching, the laser beam was fired in their direction. Before they realized what was happening, the beam had pierced the window without breaking the glass, striking Sylvia, causing her to go into some kind of strange frozen-like trance. Benedito went straight to his wife's side and was so focused on attending to her that he failed to notice the two strange entities who had entered their home. Each of these strange creatures carried something in their hands. One of them pointed this device at Sylvia, and another green laser emerged from it, once more striking her square on. Although he didn't realize it at the time, Benedito was screaming out loud for help. Several moments later, the pair's neighbor rushed into the house carrying his gun. Upon his arrival, the two creatures scampered, leaving the husband and wife and their neighbor alone. After gathering themselves, the neighbor helped Benedito carry Sylvia the short distance to his house. She eventually came out of the trance-like state and regained control of her limbs. She was, however, in a sheer state of panic about the bizarre events. Eventually, Sylvia calmed down, and all three of them thought the high strangeness of the evening was over. However, when they saw the strange object appear in the skies once more, they realized this was not to be the case. Once more the object headed in their direction, and once more it sent a green laser beam that went straight through the windows. This time it struck Benedito. Like his wife previously, he was immediately paralyzed. The craft then took off into the distance and disappeared. A short time later, Benedito regained the use of his limbs. The incident remains unexplained almost half a century later. What is interesting to note here is not the encounter occurred around the same time that Brazil was undergoing one of the strangest, most intense UFO waves in its history, lasting from the late summer of 1977 and stretching into 1978. The wave, sometimes referred to as the Colares Islands incident, not only saw hundreds of residents witness these mysterious aerial vehicles, but also saw similar attacks on people, just like that experienced by Benedito and Maria. Furthermore, some of these attacks would prove to be fatal. A 45-year-old woman, for example, who witnessed a UFO, which then shone a beam of light towards her, would pass away only 8 hours later. A similar fate awaited a fisherman who encountered one of the strange orb-like objects while on the water. Of course, whether these incidents are connected to the events experienced by Benedito Maria remains open to debate. As we can see, then battles and standoffs with otherworldly entities, as well as UFOs seemingly targeting and attacking people, while not as prevalent as sightings of strange objects, happen more than we might think. We might ask if these seemingly aggressive entities are the same as those behind other UFO sightings and even alien abductions, or whether they are a separate race, one whose appearance here is seemingly much more sporadic, although persistent. Might we expect another similar standoff type incident to be reported in the future, for example? Or have the entities behind such attacks met an untimely end, perhaps by a secretive government department who dealt with them behind the scenes, or even by another race of extraterrestrials who have taken such actions for their own unknown ends? Such accounts only serve to enrich not only the UFO mystery, but enigmas across the paranormal spectrum. For now, all we can do is wait and see if another similar standoff with otherworldly creatures unfolds. In truth, if I had encountered one of those scenarios, I'd be a nervous wreck. Because you hear of these like abductions where people are examined and they're paralyzed and they're put back. But if we're talking here like a standoff shooting, I'm on my rooftop and there's stuff with red eyes running around, no, no, no. And then it pretends to be a horse, but it's not really a horse. See, that goes beyond the abduction contactee scenario. Yeah, that right there. Yeah. But yes, very eerie indeed. So I shall be back with you and it's going to be 2025 when we resume this conversation about the weird and the unexplained. And I'm sure a lot of things will be coming our way in the new year. Till next time, take care.